Hi guys, James here from McCarthy Labs and welcome to episode 2 of the podcast. Today I'm joined by Steve Tyler. Steve is the Director of Assistive Technology at Leonard Cheshire, and this is a very, very powerful episode of the podcast, and we're only on the second one. Steve has dedicated his life, and so his career, but his whole life, to pioneering technology that enables people living with disabilities or impairments to live the fullest of lives and the most independent of lives. And Steve has done some weird and wonderful things, including, having a major part in some of the technology that grew into Alexa, Amazon Alexa, which is really interesting. And I won't spoil it too much for you. Listen to the episode and Steve talks about the story behind that. But what's clear to me from this podcast is that Steve is incredibly passionate about this, incredibly driven to make this happen. Steve communicates at the highest of levels. You know, he knows, he's very well connected with people at Microsoft and Apple and Amazon and companies like that. And these are the companies who are really investing heavily into technology that allows people with disabilities to live independent lives. I think that the value you guys will get from this is not only the types of technology that are out there, because I think that a lot of people aren't aware of what's out there, but I also think what's coming in the future will bring value to you, because we do talk about 3D printing, we talk about autonomous vehicles, and it's good to be aware of what's coming and how that will benefit people with disabilities. But I also think what's of value is that Steve's biggest fear, and he mentions this on the podcast, is that he's made so much, they not just him, but Leonard Cheshire and everybody else has made, Amazon and Microsoft and all these type of people and companies have made so much progress in the technology space when it comes to accessibility for people with disabilities or impairments, that actually, whilst we've made a lot of progress, there's a hell of a lot more to come, and there's still a lot to do. And so it's very important that the biggest businesses in the world, and even the smallest businesses, to be fair, one of the things is getting the smallest businesses to take a part in this, is that we should all spend time and money in looking at how we develop technology and how we use technology that helps increase accessibility for people with disabilities or impairments. And that to me is one of the biggest things I've taken away from this podcast. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Steve can be found on LinkedIn. Like I said, his name's Steve Tyler. He's the Director of Assistive Technology at Leonard Cheshire. We can, of course, be found on LinkedIn, but you can also visit mccarthylabs.com. And if you think you'd like to be a guest, get in touch and we'll have you on the show. Thank you very much for listening.
So, Steve, thank you so much for joining us on the McCarthy Labs podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, James, in this slightly odd place. A bit stormy here last night in stormy Peterborough, but and raining in lockdown. So
well, I'm in Leicester, and it was the same here. I'm actually working out of my office at the moment because it's just me in this one-man office. But I drove home last night from the office, and there was floods everywhere around where I was. So much so that the police had actually blocked off one of the roads. It was just incredible. I'm not seeing it like that for a while, because the weather's been so good in lockdown, hasn't it, for the past few months?
It's been incredible. Yeah, that's been one of, if there are any saving graces, that's one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel sorry for the people. I've got some customers that we work with down in London, and some of those live in flats in London with no gardens. And I said to them, I don't know how you got through lockdown without having a garden.
Terrible. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Steve, for everybody that's listening, or will be listening, or potentially watching this on YouTube, can you start by giving everybody a little bit of information about you and what you do at Leonard Cheshire, and maybe some of the weird and wonderful things you've done throughout your career?
Yes. Well, thanks again for having us on. It's a real pleasure to do it, and always a bit odd, really, to talk about what we do around. Because I suppose I've become an expert in this odd area called accessibility. And unlike regular businesses, accessibility cuts across absolutely every part of life. What I mean by accessibility, I guess, is making the world an easier place for people with disabilities to take advantage of, and to, in the way we describe it at Leonard Cheshire, live, learn and work in the manner that people choose. And of course, the technology that's now available compared to when I very first started is enormously different. So my background, I'm visually impaired myself, I'm totally blind. I have an eye condition called retinoblastoma, which is a really odd, quite rare condition. It's cancer of the retina. And at the time, oddly, and I suppose this gives you a bit of a sense of how some of the innovation and the way I think about stuff has crept into everyday life. One of the things they knew was that the retina stops growing when you reach about 5 or 6 years old, that kind of age.
Okay.
The unusual thing about retinoblastoma is, even though it's a cancer, and normally cancers replicate out of control, if you could somehow keep it at bay until the age of 5 or 6, not only did the retina stop growing, but so did the cancer.
Right. Okay.
And so that was kind of interesting from a whole host of reasons. Luckily, I was looked after by a team of amazing people. The world is very different now. I mean, then in the late 60s, early 70s, you tended to lose your sight, but if you were really lucky, you would keep your life. Today, everybody, as a rule, keeps at least some sight, and normally quite a lot. So there's been a huge reversal, but part of that has been around, you know, work in genetics, work in understanding much more about cancer, more significant treatments that are available. And I became really interested in, and in fact was part of the Genome Project for a long time, and one of the patients that were followed for about 30 years, I guess, because there was a way of learning about how well or otherwise life was going, and where had we got to in understanding as time had moved on. And for another day, but as a result of some of that work, my children have survived, were born without retinoblastoma. So,
wow.
So I genuinely live innovation, I like to think, and for me it was a massive win. But my background is clinical psychology. Went to university. In the late 80s, early 90s, if you remember back in those dim and dark days, the web was kind of an idea, and there were text browsers around, and there were lots of possibilities. As soon as I experienced the web, I suppose, I thought, my goodness, this is a game changer. And I was thinking about libraries. As a blind person, one of the biggest issues for me for years has been being able to access books and magazines and all of that. Very different days when I was at university. You know, I'd have other students reading to me. There'd be recordings made by the library and other students and specialist organizations. And then at the same time, AI happened, artificial intelligence, and the very beginning of that and some of the ideas around it were potentially amazing. And a lot of the psychology kind of teams in the area got hooked on it and were thinking, well, you know, what could the techies teach us about what are the models that they've developed, and how might they be able to teach us about what they know about the brain, or what we know about the brain, and whether we can translate some of that, and vice versa. So, and then I kind of got into the job market and became an assistant psychologist for a while, but involved in a project, and then eventually moved into technology and assistive technology especially. And then my life really has, I suppose, not deliberately, but as I started looking for ways in which you could build accessibility, as I refer to it, into mainstream technology. What did you need to do to make that work? And a lot of the companies that hold a lot of the cards, or held a lot of the cards then, really didn't know what this accessibility stuff was all about. And if anything, if you imagine, quite a lot of the time, people would refer to the disability market as a niche market. And what they meant a lot of the time is because it's just confusing. You know, if you're blind, you need, you know, audio things or tactile things. If you're deaf, you need completely the opposite. You need visual things. If you've got physical disability, well, you know, depending on what type of physical disability you've got, you require all sorts of very specialist stuff and highly personalized stuff potentially. And of course, people understand things like wheelchairs, but you know, not much innovation for a long time happened in the wheelchair market. And what you ended up with were lots of really specialist companies and a market in that field. And what I was trying to do was bring about, I suppose, a commitment from mainstream companies, create business cases, convince people that there was something in all of this. So I like to think that I and teams that I've led and worked with have really made massive changes around this space. So, for example, I worked with Nokia in the very earliest days in a little company ran by a German guy called Torsten Brand, who sadly passed away some time ago, but put together a partnership with him and Vodafone and created the very first screen reading technology for visually impaired people on the Symbian operating system. And similarly, you know, began
so was
to
that,
think, yeah.
Sorry to jump in, Steve.
No,
was
no.
that how did you? So was that essentially sort of your idea that you brought to life, or was that something that was already being done and you joined in on the project to help drive it forward? Or
it was my idea.
Wow.
When I thought about technology, and at that time, what people with disabilities, I envisioned the thing in your pocket. No one knew what the thing in your pocket would eventually be able to do.
Now it can do everything, but yeah.
Yeah. Today, of course, it's got more power. You know, there's more power in that thing in your pocket than was available to the entirety of NASA in the late 60s. It's a completely crazy idea. But what I did know is that if we could get if you think about the challenge around accessibility, it impacts on everybody's life. Imagine using a washing machine. If you can't see the screen these days, or if you don't understand, you can't see the lights or the indicators, you have massive trouble even operating something straightforward as that, or any other domestic appliance. If you've got a physical disability, same issues. You've got things to turn, things to push. You can't even reach sometimes to do it if you've got a wheelchair. You can't fit into the utility room or wherever the thing is. Or so different requirements for different people. And my rationale went something like, whatever this thing ends up being, if we play our cards right and make it accessible, then by definition, we will have a means by which you can control the world around you. So if I could make the device in your pocket accessible, if you needed it to talk to you, it would talk to you. If you needed bigger text so you could see it more easily, that's fine. If you needed to control it using specialist switch technology because all you could do was move your eyes, then let's use it like that.
Yeah.
And if I could focus in on that, then potentially we've got solutions. And that's really was the beginning of all of it. And the challenge was convincing people to do it. You know, the engineers didn't want you to touch it. There was, I think it's fair to say, Nokia saw absolutely no market in this space whatsoever. Far too complicated. And in any event, a lot of people just didn't get it. And I was working then in a place where, of a world where there was corporate social responsibility, so called. And a lot of the time, what that really meant was, and it was meant with the best of intent, there was no nastiness as such in the corporate world, but it was, look, we don't really understand this area, so CSR guys, keep these people at bay. Don't get us into trouble because regulation is coming and standards are coming. So we don't want to, let us know if we're missing a beat on that. but also don't commit to too much. Don't waste money, and frankly, make sure that they don't cause any problems for us. And I think I began to sense that and looked for much more sustainable stuff. And then, so as we became better at doing it, we became more practiced, I suppose, at delivering the business case, convincing people. So I suppose, you know, some of my claims to fame might include brokering a partnership with Amazon to deliver on text to speech, and the highest quality then text to speech that was available. And this was back in 2011, 2012, and eventually that text to speech became, or found its way into Alexa.
Let's dive into that slightly if we can, because everybody knows Alexa. Alexa's a big thing.
Everybody knows Alexa, yeah.
So how did that come about? How did you broker that partnership, and what type of partnership was that?
I was obsessing about accessing. I talked to you about books earlier on, and even until very recently, I mean, I'm a Braille reader. I listen to audiobooks, of course, and now there is synthetic speech that lets you access books in lots of different ways. But that's been a very gradual process. What we really wanted was a big backer. We wanted somebody with the minor kind of issue of having 6.5 million titles at their disposal in the form of Amazon to make their stuff accessible. I wanted to be able to read what they had. And we had lots of discussions with Amazon. We made lots of proposals because, of course, they went and delivered Kindle. And as soon as they delivered Kindle, for me, that was surely the gateway into this whole new space. But no one really wanted to play, and it was seen as too difficult. Kindle was a closed space. The technologies they wanted to keep to themselves. We came up with all sorts of possible ways of doing it. Well, maybe we could create something that could speak Kindlese, and it wouldn't let your books out of your site, but you know, it would look and feel exactly like a Kindle, and that was too difficult. And then we thought about building synthetic speech into Kindle, and that was too difficult. And eventually I realized that there was a chink in the armor, maybe, when we drilled down into why it was too difficult. The answer was, well, today's synthetic speech is rubbish, frankly. In order for people to adopt synthetic speech in a genuinely meaningful way, it's got to be good. It's got to be good quality. It's got to sound like a human being, or close to one.
Yeah, nobody wants to have a book read to them by something that sounds very much like a robot, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's got to have that human touch to it. Yeah, I agree with that. And
that was, I thought, that's it. That is the challenge. If we could break that circle, then maybe, you know, we're beginning to win. And it was a gamble, I suppose, but we needed it anyway. You know, my rationale was we needed high quality synthetic speech if we were to win the argument that said, look, we want to make more and more things accessible for people that can't read stuff. This holds true for everything. We want everything to speak. I want washing machines to speak, or have the option, ovens and domestic appliances and alarm systems and security systems of every description, domestic products, and knowing whether the lights are on or off, and all of these things.
For people who such as yourself are visually impaired, that's very important. If you can tell your washing machine to turn on and put the right cycle on, you've solved your problem there, right? If you can't see the buttons or can't, you know. So and same for people who are physically impaired. If you can't get to the washing machine but you can tell it, you're laughing. There's your solution. So yeah, you're absolutely spot on with that.
And that vein of, I suppose, development, really. So essentially, I and the team, the small team that we had, played an odd game, which was not dissimilar to what some of the more aggressive commercial companies do. And without naming names, there's one particular player in the business who basically buys up small companies who appear to be promising, and then broadly puts them in the bottom drawer until they need to use the innovation that they've just bought. So obviously they buy them to take them out of the equation, really. And then essentially embed them into their existing portfolio of products is the phrase used. And I started using similar phrases, and I thought, if I hang about for 6 to 9 months and keep an eye out on what's going on in the industry, at some point we will find a solution. And sure enough, one very small lab but very gifted set of people came to the fore, and they came from Poland. A little company called, one second.
That's fine.
A little company came to the fore from Poland, and they had a piece of technology that was genuinely game-changing. The clever part was that they had created a new voice modeling technique, which meant that it was very good at, if you recorded phrases and sentences, it could predict how you would say something even though you'd never actually said it. And that was the breakthrough, because it could sound very human. Once it had understood the pattern of speech and the way in which you spoke, then with a very minimum set of rules, which a lot of these devices rely on, or these systems rely on, it could predict how you would have said something. And that was it. Wow. We worked with them to perfect the technology. We put it to the test because what we hoped was they'd managed to create a model, and this was after about 15, 16 years of research, that would mean we could, it didn't matter what language you were using. So we put it to the test. Amongst other things, we created synthetic Welsh. Believe it or not, that's very difficult to do because because you've got Welsh as in the way people speak the language of Wales, but then you've sort of got English words but spoken in a Welsh way. So it's almost like a blend of English and Welsh. It's a really odd thing. And we created things like Icelandic just for the hell of it, really to see whether or not, you know, we could actually create this stuff and how easy it would be. And we created a model around costs and around a deliverable and how we did it. And then we approached Amazon and said, guys, we think we've taken away the reason for you not to deliver on accessible Kindles anymore. Look at what we've got. And the offer was irresistible to them. Wow. At the time, you know, they didn't know about Alexa, of course, and that came after lots of experimentation in one of the labs, and as I think some of the team behind Alexa inside Amazon would say, they spend a lot of energy innovating, and by definition they think everything they do is a pretty damn good project, which is why they do it at all. So they're kind of hoping everything they invest in, you know, comes to fruition. Alexa took everybody by storm, but the beauty was by then we'd embedded the concept of accessibility inside Amazon, and there is a great guy there who looks after the accessibility team, you know, a guy called Peter Korn, and we were motoring. Now every Kindle has accessibility built in, which means that anybody can read books in whatever format they want to read them. We have Alexa, of course, which is controllable by app. In my house, Alexa controls everything from the Nest thermostats through to, I've got a robot Hoover just under the desk here. It can Hoover by just being instructed to do it. I can control the Hoover via an app. If I had a physical impairment, or if I was a wheelchair user, for example, I can control it by swipe gestures. So I can direct the Hoover to move around the house. I have Sonos entertainment system, fully accessible. And to make this ecosystem work, you know, we've worked with Apple. I'm on a group that looks after the development around accessibility built into Microsoft Windows.
Wow.
We have very close relationships with Apple, who are, as you know, a very private company indeed, but accessibility, they lead the way. By the way, if you're, and sorry, similar, Google, of course, and the Android ecosystem, and Google Home is fully accessible, and they saw what Amazon Echo was doing, and they wanted a piece of that action, big style. And
they created their own, didn't they?
Yeah. And of course now, you know, the competition is on, and as soon as you create competition in that long-term strategy that we started, which was, what do we do to trigger this stuff that means it's going to take hold? It really changes. Similarly, you know, imagine TV, you know, did a lot of work around television, especially when digital television took over, you know, in the UK and then around the world. At the time, the majority of older people and people with disabilities, you know, had, you know, 4 or 5 channels to contend with, basically, on an analog TV, and you just pressed 1 to 5. If you were like me, a visually impaired person, you could receive the Braille TV times, and it would come through the letterbox, and you could see what was on like everybody else. Of course, in the new order, you know, you'd need a truck to deliver Braille TV times. There was no way of delivering this kind of stuff, and actually the whole business relied on electronic program guides, which were very computer oriented, or you know, technically oriented ideas. If you think about it, you know, the menus and dialogue boxes and all sorts of weird stuff appearing on screen, which for a lot of people was really very odd and scary. And for me, hugely important was to make TV accessible like the rest of the population. People with disabilities, over 98% rely on TV as their primary source of news and entertainment. And so we had to get that right. Today, you know, Android is embedded in TVs and drives TVs. So basically, if you've got an Android TV, the chances are it's going to have TalkBack and other accessibility features built in. People that have really gone to town and we work very closely with include Panasonic, and all of the Samsung range are fully accessible. Samsung has, you know, all sorts of stuff built into some of its tellies, like gesture control and so on. And of course, you can talk to it and it can talk back, and you can do all sorts of stuff. And when I started working for Leonard Cheshire, you know, this stuff really comes into its own. So for me, you know, one of the phrases I use, I suppose, all the time is technology is a great leveler. But and what I mean by that is if you play your cards right and you can get hold of the stuff. If you think about my organisation and Leonard Cheshire, you know, we're a care home provider, so we have 130 or so care homes across the UK. About 4,000 people live with us. We've got services that look after education, so support disabled young people and children into education. We've got apprenticeship schemes that we work with employers on and corporates to create apprenticeship schemes and job readiness schemes so that people with disabilities can get in. I'll come back to why in a second. And then technology, hugely important. So how can you get people engaged with technology and linked to the technology that can most help them? Despite the fact that technology is amazing, and I'll tell you why in a sec, you know, there are big cultural challenges. So if I tell you that 73% of people that lose their job involuntarily today in the UK do so because they have an acquired disability, or they've acquired a disability, or a long-term health condition. 22% of managers, recruiting managers, when we ask them, and bear in mind, you know, it's on the tin, Leonard Cheshire disability.
Yeah.
And we asked them whether they would ever recruit, assuming all things were equal, that this was the best person for the job, would they recruit a person with a disability? 22% said no. So we've got a way to go around why that is. And a lot of it's to do with fear, people not understanding, you know, all of that stuff. And yet,
so there still needs to be that culture shift or mindset shift, essentially.
Absolutely enormous challenge. And yet today, you know, I mean, here I've got an iPhone, regular iPhone. Now this device can, I mean, it can speak, and here we go. Speech on. Speech is on. Notes, reminders, clock, TV, connectivity and point folder. That's built into every iPhone. I can make this work with a Braille display, so a little specialist device that reproduces Braille for me. I can drive PowerPoints using a Braille display, using this iPhone or Windows, it doesn't matter. If I had and if I could move any part of my body, even in the smallest possible way, there are these little devices called switches, or I can control things with my eyes simply by looking. So eye gaze technology, so where you focus with your eyes begins to control what the device can do. All of this stuff is available in Windows and iPhones and Android devices and all of that. So what I started, So
do you think that, because we spoke about how years ago, you know, late 80s, early 90s, and probably a little bit, maybe even a little bit further back, that businesses had this corporate social responsibility. So they had their CSR, and maybe some of them were doing it more of as a sort of tick box exercise, or for reputation, or you know, publicly be able to say we are trying to invest in and work through technology and different things to help people with disabilities. Do you think that we've come a long way in the sense of, whilst we still need a mindset shift and a culture shift, there are businesses now like Apple and like Google and Amazon, all these companies that are actually properly, I mean, you've already pretty much said it in what you've been saying, that are really trying to pioneer this type of stuff and aren't just doing it as a tick box exercise, but genuinely want to be able to make things accessible.
I want to say yes to that. And I would say that right this second, we're in a really good place with the big blue chip companies. They buy the t-shirt 150%. Apple leads the way around iOS accessibility and what you can do with iDevices and whatever. Microsoft has embedded enormous amounts of capability into the Windows ecosystem, and not just in what you see and how you use it, but also the hooks and so on that are available to third-party vendors and all the rest of it. It's amazing. And more to the point, you know, entities like Microsoft would say themselves, they don't need me or anyone else to sort of talk about it to them anymore. They would say, you know, in order to reflect the diversity in the world, we need to make sure that we employ people in the business who are part of that diverse culture. Because frankly, and the kind of argument they would use is, if you've got, you know, a guy with a disability sitting next to a coder, and they've just coded a piece of stuff which the guy with a disability can't use, well, right there, it's not working, is it? And the fastest way of knowing that and changing the culture from inside is for people to be exposed to this as a regular everyday thing, rather than doing weird tests. The other thing is, it's genuinely begun to be recognized, I think, in some quarters as a market. So if I tell you that in the UK, you know, if you took the friends, the family of the families that have at least one person with a disability and have a yearly expenditure power of £250 billion. That's a lot of money, where if your choice is to spend on something that is half accessible and usable by your family member, versus not, you know, you're going to take the pick, you're going to choose the one that is accessible.
Mm.
At Leonard Cheshire, you know, we now have, and we're doing some really kind of amazing experiments, because what I want to do, I suppose, is change the way the care sector works. So step back for a second, and not just the care sector works, but also how people can live more independently more of the time and do what they want to do. So we've talked about Nest, and you know, there are lots of competitors out there too. And the fact that you can now control the environment that you live in. You know, imagine a scenario where at Leonard Cheshire, we've got people who have, you know, we have a specialism in brain disability, brain injury, and we're genuinely a pan disability organisation. So whatever type of disability you have, it's likely to be reflected in our organisation. And just as an aside, we operate internationally too. So we operate in 54 countries around the world. We want to make all of this stuff come alive for people in the best possible way. So some of the technologies that we're experimenting with right this second include things like predictive health analytics. So we're working with an outfit called MySense. So imagine a scenario where in your home, you're living with discrete smart monitoring solutions. So they got monitors, motion sensors, a wearable, smart plugs that know when you've turned them on, and might be electronically labeled kettle or toaster. We've got stuff under the mattress that can tell whether you've had a rough night's sleep or not. And by putting, and we've got water sensors and things like that. So by putting,
so will this help with? Sorry to jump in, Steve.
No.
Will this help with? Are you going to be able to do in terms of the analytics side of things? Will you be able to do predictions?
Yes.
So you'll be able to say, well, this person right now had a bad night's sleep last night, and therefore they may require some extra assistance, for example.
Exactly that. And then what we're doing is that the AI system, so all of this data, around 25,000 individual pieces of data per day, is collected up by the cloud-based AI system. And what it does is exactly as you've described. Firstly, it's a guardian. You know, it's a 365-day-a-year guardian. So if you fall over, if you hurt yourself, if you've got breathing difficulties, if you're having a heart attack, it will report straight away. It will trigger emergency responses.
That's amazing.
But really, the objective is that longer term, what is this person, how are they living, and what is their pattern of behaviour as a baseline? And therefore, what can we begin to deduce if that pattern changes? And it's plugged into understanding longer term indicators of health conditions, or your health changing, can be improving, but it could be declining. And well before physically you can see anything as a carer, or even the individual themselves necessarily knows, they're beginning to be able to pick that up. So for example, if you appear to be drinking well enough and you're having your regular cups of tea, except you appear to be dehydrated according to all system measures, there's a bit of an issue.
There's an issue, yeah.
And all of that begins to be kind of under. And what the carer and family member and the individual gets is a little dashboard every day. So gets rid of all the complexity. It says, you know, stable, improving, declining. And depending on the level of decline, you can dig into that and find out. So now the conversation changes, and imagine the cultural change that happens. Really tricky to some extent, because you've got this new technology and people are a bit scared of this stuff for good reason, I have to say. You know, what data is being collected about you, who's using it.
It's the whole Big Brother thing, right? It's like the NHS tracing app that people have been talking about constantly. And you have some people that say it's fantastic, nothing wrong with you. Other people that say, well, it's just another step in the game of Big Brother, of being able to know every. Yeah, you always will have that fear. I think it's quite. Again, it's a cultural change, isn't it?
Big cultural change, and it genuinely is scary. I think, as I'll come to in a sec. But But imagine the revelation that happens, because for everybody in a way, because stepping back, just think of your elderly parents or your grandma, granddad, or elderly aunts and how they are. As a rule, people who are older or people who have a disability, if you were to straightforwardly say, so how are you doing? I mean, they'll either say, oh, I'm fine. Or they'll say, I mean, they'll complain endlessly about their aches and pains or whatever. But as a rule, they're not going to say, oh, you know, I can't cope, or I'm having real trouble.
No.
Largely because people who are older and people who have disabilities, as a rule, tend to be amazingly good at making do. And also it's very difficult for them to imagine what the world could be like. So it's really hard if you're not plugged into technology very well and you don't really understand. And there's no reason, there's never been a reason for you. You've lived your perfectly ordinary life for the past 40 years, and there's no real reason that you've ever discovered as to why you should change that. So instead of
see, I think, Steve, that is what you've said there is actually really, I hadn't ever thought about it like that. You said that people with either potentially disabilities or older people are very good at making do. You don't just want to make do, though. You don't just want to cope, essentially. You want to live to the fullest that you can possibly live.
Exactly.
And it's that, it's very easy for, and I've seen it in care homes. My wife's gran was recently in one before she passed. It's very easy to spend the day. I watched her. Very easy for her to spend the day sitting down in one chair, barely moving, and watching the television. Now, when we would go and we would bring her out for the day, the change in her was incredible.
It's a revelation.
Exactly, but because the accessibility isn't necessarily where it needs to be all the time, or people aren't aware that this technology can help them get out without actually needing somebody to come and get them out, for example. It's that if people were aware of that, and which is clearly what you guys are doing at Leonard Cheshire, which is absolutely amazing. If people were aware that the technology can actually help them be more independent, if you like, maybe that's not the best word, but be able to do these things without having to wait for somebody to come and help them do it, they could live life to the fullest. And I think that's what, for me, it's not just about can they read the book or can they, that type of thing. It's really about, can they go and experience the things that they really should be experiencing and want to experience without feeling like they can't and they're just having to make do and cope.
And you've hit exactly on it, Ben. That's precisely where we are. So imagine now you walk in as a carer or as a member of the family, that you make a call or whatever, and say, instead of saying, are you all right? You're already armed with data. So now the conversation is, oh, you seem to have a bit of a rough night's sleep last night. Or, don't know that you're drinking properly, Gran. Are you sure you're okay? Because it looks like you're not really drinking. You're in already. The conversation is a whole different place.
Well, because they can't just say, no, I'm fine.
Right.
Because you're able to say to them, look, I can tell where you're at with this type of thing.
Yeah. And by definition, the conversation is at a different level.
Yeah.
Then in addition, what we've been doing is a piece of work to really up the game, so push the technology as far as you can push it. So I've been talking about people with physical disabilities and with learning disabilities and all kinds of disabilities, quite often a combination of those things. So we've put communication technology in, using that Windows infrastructure that I talked about, where we've got Microsoft to change the way it works and so on. Now you can use things like Grid 3. So Grid 3 is a little communication device, and it doesn't mind how you communicate, whether you've got the most weird and wonderful pointing technology, switch technology, you use your eyes to control the device, it doesn't mind. The beauty is it can control other devices for you or communicate, because it's built on Windows ecosystem itself. So now you begin to be able to control all of these devices around your home, or you can make a Skype call, you can do a Zoom call, you can do whatever you want. If you've got the ability to do it, you can turn the telly over yourself. One of the, and this sounds crazy, so For a lot of people, when I, that we're working with right now, because the technology simply hasn't been available and people don't know about what there is,
Mm-hmm.
and if it is, even if it is available, it's very difficult to understand how you match the right technology to the right need
Sure.
that people have.
Sure.
So the way care homes, as a rule, or well, as a rule, often tend to work is, if you've got a cohort of people who have lots of different types of disability or are elderly enough, and they can't, for example, turn the TV over, then you'll have somebody in the care staff positioned somewhere around the communal TV area, just in case someone wants to turn the telly over. And that is a completely mad, in today's world, waste of resource, because actually what we want them to be doing is spending time talking to, socializing with,
Actually caring,
doing activity, doing what they were paid to do, rather than doing all of that. Now, the grid-free stuff and all of that, the power in this technology we know is there. So if I tell you that before implementing this suite of technologies that we've been doing and experimenting with, placing Hill House in Leonard Cheshire, so we've got 24 residents who are taking advantage of the stuff right now, and then we're planning to roll it out. But to prove that we knew what we were talking about, we've 3 people who have never communicated, the eldest for the longest time 17 years, the shortest time 11 years. 3 people communicated, after all, within an hour of being shown the technology. So this is hugely, this is game-changing stuff.
And is this Steve, just very quickly, is this being developed in-house at Leonard Cheshire, or are you outsourcing this?
We work in partnership. So what we like to do, I mean, there are some things that we have done, and Leonard Cheshire himself as a guy, when he very first set the organisation up, was a real innovator in many respects.
Right. Okay.
And we do maintain that tradition, but today it's easier to work with people and make sure that we articulate the need properly. So a good example of that, and if we thought that privacy is an issue now, I would say we've seen nothing yet. So
I would agree.
I was with a range of developers last year, and if I tell you that, and we're going to be beginning to trial some of this stuff with Google and with other partners, but if I tell you that today we can interpret brainwave technology, brainwaves, such that still quite limited, between 500 and 800 words stroke phrases, can be understood by the technology and then turned into synthetic speech. So if you can't speak for yourself, then it can interpret what you're trying to say or what you wanted to say.
That's incredible.
And then deliver it for you. In addition, and this is the power of embedding that concept of accessibility and understanding around what people really need. Think about speech translation systems that Google have. So they've invested a lot of time and energy to translate languages. Through tweaking those translation systems, we're able to begin to understand people with complex speech or difficult to understand speech. Put it this way, difficult enough that I can't understand their speech, that Google does understand.
Wow. And
then you've got the blend of biology and technology, and there's a great YouTube video released by Apple, and this is quite old now actually, and it's called Changing the World One App at a Time, and it features a range of examples, but one is when we worked with Apple to sort of embed this whole idea of accessibility and why this was hugely important, and in the early days they adopted this concept that goes, if we build an ecosystem that has all the accessibility capability in, and if we make sure that the stuff we develop ourselves has accessibility in, recognizing that you might want something else. You might not like what we've gone and developed, and you might want your own. Or there might be stuff that we simply haven't bothered doing, which you really want. Well, that's fine, because that's the whole power of the app ecosystem. And the beauty is it's got accessibility built in. So there is an example of a girl who is has a prosthetic foot, and she's a swimmer.
Okay.
And what she used to have to do is go to her medical centre every morning before she went swimming to adjust her foot so that it was in swimming mode. And then when she'd finished, she'd have to go back and adjust it for walking mode.
Walking,
so it was
yeah.
in walking. Now, of course, she uses an app.
Mm.
I work with a colleague who has a heart condition. They adjust and monitor what's going on with him through an app. And these systems are beginning to gradually blend sort of biologically with people. Right at the other end of the spectrum, you've got organizations who are really pushing the boundaries because, in short, they've seen the light in that they've recognized that the world is getting older. We are living longer. We are costing more by definition. And we all need, one way or another, more care. We need new ways of thinking about this stuff. So people like Toyota have rechristened themselves, rebranded themselves as a mobility company because they've recognized that cities are changing, the requirements are changing. People who want to still get around have different physical or cognitive or whatever requirements. So they've begun to invest in different types of vehicles, but also in assistive technology like robots that will help you walk along. I've seen one of the robots is absolutely astonishing, where, as we all know, everyone can tell stories about Alexa and, elderly mothers and aunts and so on becoming, I know mine is, she treats Alexa as if she's got a personality, and she gets really quite irritated with Alexa when she doesn't understand and has a go as a stupid, I can't believe, all of that. Well, in exactly the same way, there's a piece of work going on with care robots, and in the care community, normally if you want to move somebody, if they can't move themselves, or if you're in a hospital environment, you need to pick somebody up, you need two people to do that. And there's a specific procedure for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
In the new order, we suspect, to begin with anyway, you'll only need one person to do the picking up, the other being a care robot. Yeah. And there's an elderly woman featured on a video at Toyota, and I'll never forget when I very first saw this thing, where she exactly talks about the care robot as if it is a human being. Some of it, and she will say, oh, I don't know what I'd do without him. He is indispensable. Oh. Now, part of this is because people begin to attribute human attributes to devices and systems and so on. It's a perfectly natural thing to do on one level. The other, though, I think is testament to what Toyota and others have been doing, where they've been investing a lot of energy in understanding what exactly is that. How do you make people feel like they're safe? What is the nature of feeling safe? And how, if somebody picks you up and holds you, what is it that's going on? And what is the precise nature of that means that you have a sense of safety? And they've tried to build that in to.
I suppose that's very, very tricky, actually.
It's a real challenge.
Because for me, if I think about somebody picking me up, I don't know what it is that would make me feel safe. I mean, looking at the person, I wouldn't want my 18-month-old daughter to try and pick me up, but I wouldn't mind, one of my closest friends who's 6'5" and he could pick me up, type of thing. So I don't know what it is that makes. It's not just that, though, is it? It's also almost a bit of a. I suppose if you were thinking about a robot picking you up, and I mean that's amazing that we're already getting to that type of level of innovation. And I want to go on to in a minute, because you spoke a lot about the different types of tech and AI and that type of stuff, but I want to go on to where you see it now going in the future as well. But I suppose when I think about something picking me up, I think if it did it once and did it twice and did it 3 times, I'd then start to feel more confident. But it's getting the confidence to do it just that first time, isn't it?
You're so
that's
right. Yeah,
an extremely difficult thing to innovate with a robot, that is. But clearly they're doing it. Then are they still in trials with that, or is that the type of thing that's
and large scale trials too. And I think the commitment goes right back to a question, we were talking about earlier on. Has the world changed such that technology is becoming more accessible, and people really have bought the t-shirt around accessibility and understand that there's a whole, 20% of the world has a quote disability. This is a big, I mean, in a way, it's a kind of crazy idea to think of it as disability, because it's sort of, there's just differences in capacity, capability in all of us. Now, some of it is more extreme, and originally, I suppose, people tended to think of it as disabling, but by definition, if you couldn't walk, well, you couldn't get upstairs. There are some things you just couldn't do. But there is every conceivable, between the most extreme and the least extreme, there is every conceivable piece in the jigsaw along that road. And I think what is happening is the bigger companies are beginning to embrace that and understand. On the other hand, a good example, Age UK a while ago wrote a report, and it's complicated stuff, I think, James, that I've been in this thing for years trying to understand reactions and humanity and how people adopt or don't adopt new technologies and so on. The interesting finding, as an Age UK report published a few years ago now, which essentially said, well, guys, here we are, 50 years down the track, 50 years after we all acknowledged, all the research, all the pointers said, the world is getting older. We're going to be living longer. We're going to have more disabilities. We're going to need more accessibility. We're going to need design and rethinking of the way we live in our homes and what have we actually done about it? And the finding is, in some quarters, a fair amount, but actually pretty disappointing, really. We've not actually taken the data that seriously. We all know it and we all quote it, but we haven't really done very much about it. And partly it's because it's complex. So consider this as a sort of thought experiment. If you, as an elderly person, have a choice between, so what we know is over 50s, they love to go out to restaurants. Big sweeping statement, but as a rule, they've got less money, especially by the time they retire, less cash available to them, but the amount they do have is freer to do with what they like. And they quite like going to restaurants. So if you survey people and say, right, so, you've got restaurant A, which is fully accessible, or restaurant B, which is not very accessible. But restaurant A, although it's fully accessible, isn't the kind of place you would normally go to. And restaurant B might be somewhere you would normally go to. None of this matters to people, of course, not surprisingly. What they would say is, look, I don't make my decision like that. I go on A, what I like to eat, B, where are my friends going? Where do my family want to go? I'll go there. If you were to say, if there was one down the road that was exactly the same as the one that you like going to, but it happens to have a loo that you can use, would you go to it rather than, well, yeah, of course. But I wouldn't choose the loo over everything else. Having said that, when I was working on transport and transport accessibility, one of the pieces of work I was doing, it was really interesting because we tackled a whole host of issues around train travel. So if you think about, you know, what are the barriers to entry for people with disabilities around travel of any description? You know, first it's like, how do you even find out about the stuff? You know, can you find the timetable? Do you know where the bus stop is, or do you know where the train station is? How far is it away? How will you get there? Do you know when you've got to the place where you're going? And you know, all of these things. You can book assistance. Well, how easy is it to book assistance? And do you have to give them an advance notice? And not everybody accepts assistance. Anyway, we did loads and loads of work on this stuff. And then right at the end, when we thought we'd cracked everything, we're like, okay, let's do the try a train day. Let's get people, we think we've fixed the universe. Let's get everybody there and see whether or not we've ticked all the boxes on the planet and made sure. And of course, we did. It's all good until everyone got on the train. And then we discovered that regardless of all the research, regardless of all the insights and the data and the marketing and the blah, what we discovered is, what is it that actually makes the big fundamental difference between whether you will get on the train or not? And the big thing is, is there availability of a toilet within, let's say, 45 minutes? Will I be able to go? Because if I can't be sure that there is a loo there,
that you can actually go.
Yeah. And I don't really want to talk about that. I don't really want to make a big deal about it. I just won't bother. I just won't go, because it's all too difficult. It's all too embarrassing, and chances are it won't be possible. So it's just better to forget about it. And it's stuff like that that I think is fascinating, where people are making decisions about what they will and won't do, but it's very difficult sometimes to unpick what is it. You know, when we did big breakthrough, imagine, you know, loads of market research. I ticked all the boxes when we led the digital TV stuff. Big companies like Panasonic and Samsung and John Lewis selling all of these products and everything, but nonetheless, we did the market testing, and we were like, okay, so look, we've delivered everything they want. And the crazy thing about it is, if you asked people before we did it, if you said, would you like accessible TV? They'd say, no, not really, not that bothered.
Yeah.
Really? Yeah, well, as long as I know when Coronation Street's on at 7:30 and I can tune into that, that's fine for me. You know, I don't need all this stuff that you talk about. I don't even know what you're talking about when you talk about electronic program guides and all these things. I'm not that bothered. When they see it, of course, they say, oh, right, yeah. No, well, obviously, if you'd said, I'd have that. And then you go one step further and turn up at John Lewis and say, do customer service and say, well, guys, you know, we've got a whole bunch of products now that are fully accessible out of the box. Will you buy it? And a surprising number, around 30% would say, no, I don't think so. And you, in a shocked fashion, as I was, would say, really? Why not? And the answer is, accessibility itself has a weird kind of perception in some people's minds. Around 30% of customers who might benefit from accessible product, what they would say is, accessibility normally means something big and horrible. It's probably yellow and black, and it's something with big buttons, things that I wouldn't want in my house. Basically, what I want is something I can use. You deliver that to me. I don't know what you mean when you talk about this accessibility malarkey, but what I want is something I can use. Now that's a tricky nut to crack, you know, and you know, eventually, but having said all of these things, you know, with the might of Apple, you know, think about that. Every store in the world, if you walk into an Apple store, there will be somebody there that can tell you the wonders of the accessible, and more to the point, they'll show you and train you in the use of what their technology can do, including the accessibility stuff. Even with all the marketing might they have and the massive investment they put into this stuff and the enormous kind of capability in relative terms they've got, people still come in and say, oh, well, you know, I'm looking for something that I can use. I don't think you've got anything. They say, oh, yeah, we've got a whole bunch of things here around accessibility. And the punter will say, oh, well, if you mean, oh, you know, I know about Siri. And they'll say, no, not talking about Siri. We're talking about, you know, magnification. We're talking about fully fledged screen reading technology that can, and people are clueless. They have no idea.
So what do you think? What do you think the solution is? Is it education? Is it awareness? Is it what is it? Or do you think that as, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, do you think that as the younger generations are starting to come through, you know, people that were born in the 90s and 2000s, do you think for them this will be more this will be easily adopted rather than necessary? Do you think that it's harder? You know, is it I imagine it's much harder to go to a 75 or an 80-year-old right now and try to explain to them and get them to be aware of all of the capabilities when we talk about accessibility that Apple have, for example. Whereas you explain that to a 20-year-old, they probably are going to be more aware, or they're going to be more engaged with it. Do you think? Absolutely. Do you think that's one of the issues?
They're one of the big issues. The children today, and the guys born in the 90s and mid 80s have a different expectation. They've been born with this stuff, and they expect things to work. They want it to be, because actually it's part and parcel of the way in which they socially engage in a way that wasn't, you know, I remember knowing or recognizing, even I'm embedded in this stuff every day, you know, talk about it. The then 3-year-old son, I remember thinking, my goodness, what is all that about? Because we would say, oh, digital natives, and children are born with iPads and tablet devices and screens, and of course, and I was absolutely astonished when he got really frustrated when he swiped the screen on the telly and it wouldn't do anything, and he was appalled at that. And I thought, my goodness, we are in a different world, you know, and that's the power. So I think there's that. I think you're absolutely right. At the other end of the spectrum, how do you talk about accessibility to a you know, 65-year-old, 75-year-old person at the other end of the spectrum? And part of the challenge as well is a lot of this stuff is, when you think about what we do, not only from a visual point of view, when you look at your Windows screen, for example, there are concepts that you visually look at. You might not know the names of them, and you might not necessarily be bothered, but you kind of figure out how they work. And as you go, you gradually become kind of embedded into the way they think. Add on to that the additional complexity, in my case. So imagine that when you look at a thing called the ribbon on which is a sort of a menu type system, although it's a bit more complicated than menu system. They've made it more complicated now, and as people have got with the program, they've added and amended and whatever. I've got to try to translate that in those visual concepts, which is where it's driven from, into verbal concepts that somehow make sense. So, for example, I have to know the difference between a dialog box, a radio button, a combo box, a list box. And all of these things are interesting from a technical point of view, but when it starts kind of impacting on, you've got to understand this stuff, because if you want to make a screen reader work with it, or a piece of switch technology work with it, you have to know this stuff. And it's actually quite a burden, because you've got to be very invested. You've got to kind of think, I'm doing this because I fully recognize and wholeheartedly acknowledge the benefit it's going to bring to me. That's why I'm doing it. And that's quite a difficult sell, because if before the journey you don't really know quite why. It's the classic example of Mrs. Miggins has son in Australia, you know, and if she would learn Skype, she can talk to him and see him. That's a big draw. If you can find that draw, happy days. But if you can't, it's quite a difficult sell.
Do you think that that's going to be one of the do you think that that's going to be one of the hardest things when we talk about, so when we talk about like AI, for example, it's great and there's a lot of innovation in it. It's still not where it needs to be, and there's still a lot more to come. And I think things have actually taken longer than expected when we talk about the world of AI. But anyway, do you think that one of the problems from a technology that aids accessibility, do you think that one of the issues you will have is keeping up with the tech? So when Microsoft, when Apple, when they change certain things, or when they innovate and do new things, in order to make that new innovation accessible, is it difficult to keep up with that, keep up with the ever-changing landscape of technology?
Very difficult, especially because, as you know too well, there are now updates in Windows every 4-6 months, and a lot of it is under the hood. A lot of it doesn't really matter. But, accessibility changes, its capability changes. It's a gradual process. But as time goes on, it does change quite fundamentally. And what's beginning to happen now, interestingly, is having argued for mainstream accessibility, which we've begun to get in spades, but you do get what you're given. And what's beginning to happen is amalgamation in the sector. So you've got a lot, the big owners of big operating systems, well, you can name them on one hand. The big players around production, a lot of the way production happens at the moment, in the end, you're dealing with really very large companies. And what's beginning to happen is that the more complex end of disability is actually being left out. So the weird kind of thing that really shouldn't be happening, but is in this new amazing world of technology, where there used to be specialist businesses that would focus on personalization. Frankly, there's no money in it anymore, and it's too complicated. It takes too long. It costs too much. And you can't really fix some of it anyway because you haven't got the capacity to deliver. Now, I believe that will change. I hope it will. And if we have half a chance of making it change by guiding the way technology develops, which is what we're trying to do, and I think it is a requirement, actually, more and more of disability organisations to make sure they do focus on this stuff and make sure that we get delivered what we want. That's the only way we're going to control the stuff. To your question around harder to learn as well, and harder to, I think, until the day when we get brain to cloud interface and things like that, where at the moment interfaces are really quite straightforward on one level. They tend to be focused around a particular attribute. You've got visual interface, you've got how the screen works and how you operate the screen with a mouse or with touch, or you've got speech, speaks to you, or you can speak. Those two last things are quite new. For a long time, we've been, tangling with windows and mice and screens and things. And what will happen in the next interface revolution? And with any luck, maybe AI becomes so bright as to be able to predict the challenges that you've got, or morph into an interface that you can more easily manage.
And do you think so? I mean, I have to say, I could sit here and we could do a podcast for probably 8 hours straight, Steve, with the amount of knowledge that's in your head and the things that you're spouting. I mean, this is amazing because a lot of this is focused around AI, and that's what this podcast is all about, RPA and AI. So that's absolutely amazing. But to try and sort of wrap this up, is it fair to say, and maybe it's not, but is it fair to say that you firmly believe that one of the biggest benefits to people who have some form of disability or impairment or whatever you want to call it, do you think that really one of the biggest things that is going to enable accessibility, is going to be able to enable people to become more independent? Do you think that technology is that? Do you think that technology is one of the biggest things that's going to make that happen?
Yeah, and I'll give you an example of why I think that on a very personal level. I talked about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was at university.
Yeah.
If I wanted a book, I would ask a specialist provider to record it for me or braille it. If I wanted it in braille, I'd have to give 2 years notice. And they may or may not do it.
Wow.
If I wanted it recording, well, if I could get the right people to record it and whatever, and believe it or not, in those dark and horrible, publishers could say no. Publishers could say, no, we're not going to let you do it.
Yeah.
It's our book, and we're not doing it. No, we don't have it in a format you can read, but tough luck. That's the format it's in. Now, I can, and I remember this revelation happening to me about 5 or 6 years ago, not long. Well, I used to have a challenge with a friend, you know, so that we could check out how quickly, how fast things were moving. We'd worked on publishing standards, and really the publishing world has revolutionized over the past 200 years, you know, whereas what they used to do and the traditional model was, and it stood them in good stead, you know, which is why no one wanted to change a lot of it, you know, and there were lots of reliance on the chain of delivery. People made lots of money out of it, but the rule of thumb was, okay, how many do we think we'll sell? Well, I don't know. We think we could do a run, 25,000 units. We'll print 25,000 books, and when 25,000 were sold, they'd say, right, do we think we'll sell another 25,000 or not? No, we don't. All right, well, we won't do it again then. That's the end of that. Whereas now, believe it or not, when you buy a book from Amazon, and when James puts in his order for a hard copy book from Amazon, chances are it's a specially printed for James at Lightning Source in Milton Keynes and delivered to your house the following day or whatever. And the reason that's possible is on-demand printing, complete revolution of the standards around all of this stuff and the publishing standards. And what really was amazing, and I take advantage of that electronically. So I was lying in bed and there was a podcast, I was listening to a podcast, weird enough in itself, if you think about it, 5 or 6.
Absolutely.
You know, that was just incredible that you could even do this stuff now.
Podcasting's just come out of nowhere, hasn't it? I know there's been variations of it over the years, but podcasting's come out of nowhere. You're right. And, people make good money. You know, I was at a recording recently of you know, there's a great This Week in Tech is one that you might know, with Leo Laporte, and I was lucky. I went to a recording session of his a while ago. Just, you know, and it's a business. It's because become a new way of delivering stuff. Well, so listening to podcasts, they mentioned a book, and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And without really thinking about it, I went on, in this case, I went on the iBookstore. Weird, because I've got lots of choice now. Could have gone to Amazon, could have gone to lots of different places. Went to the iBookstore, found the book, paid for it, downloaded it while I was listening to podcasts. And it was only the day after I thought, actually, that is astonishing. The fact that I could just have that book when I wanted now is an absolute revelation. It's amazing.
And that's, I think, the power of where we are.
And do you think that now, I totally agree with you. I think that's absolutely amazing. Do you think that now, where do you see, where do you see, not in the sense of where do you see it going, but what do you think still one of the biggest things that you need to solve is it getting people the ability to be able to physically go out. Let's say people in a care home is one of the biggest things that you guys are trying to do. I know you're working on health analytics, but you know, we spoke before we actually started recording this about autonomous vehicles, for example.
Yeah.
Is the next big thing. We know there's a lot of information, there's a lot of innovation in the home and in the care home, which is fantastic. But in terms of people actually being able to, maybe physically impaired people being able to get out into the world, you know, go to the high street, go to wherever it may be, go to the coffee shops, go to the restaurants. Do you think that that's where the next round of innovation really needs to focus?
I do. So the way I tend to think about this really is because a lot of people would say, you know, what do blind people want to read? Well, surprise, surprise, they want to read the same as everybody else. There's no different. What do people with disabilities want to do? Well, they want to do what you do.
Same
They
things.
want to, there is no difference. And in people's heads, there is so in broad terms, you know, but if you were to, you know, put some level of prioritization over it, I would say as a rule, people want to go and see who they want to go and see when they want to go and see them. They want to socialize when they want. They want to go shopping when they want. They want the freedom to go for a coffee. So basically they want retail. They want to look after their money. Or use money in the way money, you know, without the ability to use your money or access money or decide where your money is going, you know, as a really fundamental part of today's life. If you haven't got control of that or can't access it or don't have choice about it. And then, and all the things associated with it, like paying for things. And transport, of course, is part of the glue that links all of that together. And then the broader kind of issues of technology. I would say innovation in those areas are absolutely critical. I'd say I spend what do I wake up and worry about? I wake up and worry about firstly making sure that we are getting it right. That the investment, the energy is being put into the right arena. Secondly, that we don't lose the wins we've made. And that really does petrify me. So today, you know, if you had said to me, Steve, you know, in 10 years' time, one of your favorite devices is going to be a touch screen based flat piece of glass with no tactile way of you knowing anything at all about what's going on other than haptics. That's going to be a big thing too. What do you think? I would have thought you were nuts. And yet it is the thing that I rely on all the time. If you were to take that away from me, there's nothing to replace that today. And I think one of the issues that we've got is to get long-term commitment from companies that currently don't have it. That don't have that commitment to accessibility, but also making sure that we don't lose the benefits we've got. One of the learnings that I've established is, in the end, it doesn't matter about business cases, doesn't matter about any of this stuff. In the end, these people, the people that run big companies, are like me and you on one level, which is they are human beings impacted by stuff they know and understand and learn. And the biggest impact in nearly every case has been where a CEO or senior director of a company has had direct exposure, one way or the other, to disability. All of a sudden, they get it. All of a sudden, they recognize why this is important. Or when they're challenged by their mum, who says, you know, you own this big car, you run this big company, surely you could do something about it. And all of a sudden, it's got meaning. And my worry is a time when that culture, you know, CEOs move on, directorates change.
The meaning's no longer there.
And then to your thing,
I can see that.
And to your thing about what we should change, I would say there's some really big things coming that I hope if we can harness. 3D printing, I think, hugely important. And one of the reasons it's important for the disability community is you can begin to think about developing interfaces, products even, devices more locally. And if you have an open design principle, a little bit like we have shareware in the shareware community and open source in the open source community, you can imagine 3D printing designs being made available, but delivered to you locally, or creating your own if you don't like what there is. So there's that, appifying the 3D printing community. The other thing I think is going to be autonomous vehicles. And different ways of travel. My fear around all of that is huge, you know, and I've experienced an autonomous vehicle, you know, being on the Google strategy stuff and so on. I've had the fortune to travel. It is amazing, long way to go still, but when it happens, I mean, it will happen in the way that I think, you know, we haven't really, it'll gradually impinge on our lives, and we'll eventually begin to sort of, but there are these models that people have in their heads already, you know, imagine Uber, but this time run by an intelligent vehicle, which you might own, and your vehicle goes out and works for you until you want it back. And it becomes a taxi while you're not in it, and when you're back it comes, and lots of kind of examples. The interesting thing for me though is governments kind of tend to focus, you know, I've done a lot of spiel, as you might expect, about trying to get accessibility into these things because it's a critical kind of element. And one of my kind of worries is that some of the conversations are in the wrong place. So government will obsess, for example, about how safe or otherwise these things are, and then they have to be 100% safe. And there are people like me that say, well, that's just silly because it's not going to be 100% safe. So shall we move on from that discussion, because that's going to get us nowhere fast. But if you're saying, you know, it could be safer than, you know, safer than regular driving, that's fine. I begin to get that. But the thing that you should be worrying more about government are the economic impacts. So, for example, today people buy and sell houses on the strength of there being near transport hubs and near connectivity. Well, in the world of autonomous vehicles, transport hubs will no longer exist in quite the way they do today. There'll be no need for them. Now what? What does that do to the economy? What does that do to inner cities and town development and what we currently... And I think they'd be wiser to focus on that. And the reason I really worry and obsess about these things is because we've all seen, you know, there's a slide that I use in one of my presentations at conferences such as these, where I sort of say, you know, let's be on the same page as each other. Let's just remember some stuff, you know, and I say things like, you know, Google is a verb. Google has become a verb in the English language. Amazon has benchmarked how we do online stuff. It's taken it 20 years. It's been a gradual process. Used to sell CDs and books. Now it sells everything, and it's established a marketplace. And despite people's kind of worry and so on about both of those entities, we still use them. Why? Because they have they've made the world convenient. And we've changed the way we kind of tend to think and want things. We want things now. We're not going to wait. We want things on demand, not just on videos, but everything. We want everything like that. And all of that has become possible, or more possible. If we wanted to genuinely protect the high street, because we're obsessed about the importance of the local shop or the importance of the local infrastructure, we would have been having those conversations 20 years ago. Today, it's too late. The infrastructure has moved on. We're in different places. People have different mindsets. And in the same way, in order to embrace some of the technology coming around the corner, especially things like driverless vehicles and 3D printing technology. Imagine 3D printing technology, big supply chain change, potentially. If you can either print off in your house or design something in your house, or get someone to design it for you, and then pop down the local shop, 3D printing shop, and get what you need. That's a that's an amazing thing potentially. That's, you know, I think that's where it's going. I think we're going to see really, really big change around how things are delivered, people's expectation, and that interplay. But one thing is for sure, you know, the interfaces and the changes that people experience and so on around how technology begins to live with them and be part of their lives. I think that's going to be a bit, the biomedical stuff, robotic stuff, coming together into people's lives. I think that's going to be the big overall change, and in that mix will be autonomous vehicles and all the rest of it.
Well, Steve, I have to say this has been an amazing podcast episode. It really has. I'm not just saying that. I had no idea some of the things that we were doing in this space, and to see you're clearly extremely passionate about it, which is fantastic. And you're right, the fear of this dropping away is what you don't want. But I actually think that so much progress, well, I hope that so much progress has been made. How could you possibly take a step back and stop innovating and stop progressing?
Keep hanging on to that. Yeah.
That's it exactly. But no, seriously, Steve, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really powerful episode, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who will get a lot of benefit from listening to this. And I'd absolutely say I'd love to have you back on this again. This is something, the McCarthy Labs podcast is what we want to do for the foreseeable.
And I'm very happy to, next time we do it, or even in the meantime, we can supply you with some of the show and tell stuff. So we've got videos of this stuff, and maybe that could be a...
Well, it's funny that you say that. We're actually, as part of our customer base, we're talking to a lot of care homes at the moment, a lot of care providers, all across the UK, and actually venturing out a little bit further than the UK. And it'd be very interesting to be able to showcase some of what you guys are doing to them. So this podcast, for one, will be very helpful for them. I'll point them towards this, but absolutely, we'll take this offline. And if you can give me some of that information, some of the actual tangible things I can show them, that would be fantastic.
Very good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, and thanks for having us on and listen to me witter for about an hour and a half.
It's been brilliant. Thank you so much, Steve.
Cheers.